Hello. So let's talk a little bit about Chapter 1. Hopefully by now you've read the chapter, and it should become apparent to you, not all that surprisingly, that Chapter 1 really just kind of lays out the framework for what anthropology is. And if nothing else, I hope what becomes very clear is that anthropology is an incredibly broad discipline. I've always liked to, I always like to say that the definition of anthropology that is my favorite is that anthropology studies humans in all times and places. And just that definition, I mean, all times, humans have been on this planet for 200,000 years. Our ancestors go back to at least 8 million years ago. That's a lot of time to study. And then all places, globe's a pretty big place, and humans and our ancestors have been scattered all over the globe. So that leads to a whole lot of material for us to study. So we are an incredibly broad discipline. If you take a look at this graphic, you'll see that, as is kind of spelled out in the book, but one useful way to think of that broad discipline is to break anthropology down into sort of subfields or subdisciplines. And for me, the easiest way to think of it is in what I call what is called the four field approach. And in the four field approach, the broad discipline of anthropology is broken down into four subfields. Two of those are the major subfields of cultural anthropology and physical, or more commonly becoming referred to as biological anthropology. And then two minor subfields that are inside of cultural archaeology and linguistics. Our class is basically going to follow that format. For the first half of the class, we're going to focus mostly on biological anthropology. We'll talk about evolution. We'll talk about the human fossil record. We'll talk about non-human primates. We'll talk about modern human variation. And then we'll make this subtle shift about halfway through, and we'll begin to focus more heavily on cultural anthropology. So we'll look at religion, and we'll look at politics, and we'll look at what we eat, and we'll look at how we dress, and we'll look at our artwork and the people that we marry and all these other things that make up our day-to-day existence. For most students, I'll be honest, this first half of the class, the biological anthropology half, can be very challenging. And as we will talk about in Chapter 2, a big part of the reason for that is because in the United States, we do a terrible job in our public school systems of teaching science, biology in particular. And that's primarily because of political and cultural, social concerns about evolution, which, as I said in Chapter 2, hopefully I'll put most of those concerns to rest, because sadly it's a foolish argument that we shouldn't even be having in our country, but we do. And it impacts our education, and that's unfortunate. So what that means is that a lot of you may not come into this class with a ton of biology or biological background. That's okay. We're not going to get into a great deal of it, but there will be some. And as I said, because this is more biologically based than the cultural part of the course, a lot of people often struggle a little bit with it. But hopefully we can definitely work through those challenges. Now, with all of that in mind, there is one final point that I want to make, and that is that it is very important. One of the things that underlies what the authors write about in Chapter 1 and is a characteristic of anthropology as a whole, and will be a theme that we keep returning to for the entire semester, is that anthropology is a science. And as such, there are certain things that anthropology does. So we can ask ourselves this question: what is a science? And I'm a quote guy, so I always enjoy hearing some people's thoughts, sharing some people's thoughts on what science is or a particular thing is to them. When we talk about anthropology as a science, it's important to note that anthropology is a social science. That means that it's different from things like biology and chemistry and physics, which are called the natural sciences. Some people call them the hard sciences. And the social sciences they call the soft sciences. It's an unfortunate distinction, but it's one that we do make. Other social sciences include things like psychology and sociology, geography to a certain extent, history to a certain extent, political science, economics. And the big difference between what anthropology does as science and what biology does as science is that anthropologists study humans, and that limits us. Think about if I'm a scientist, I'm a biologist, and I'm interested in a particular type of cancer and the outcomes that a particular drug cocktail has on a particular type of cancer. Nobody's going to bat an eye if I take 5,000 lab rats and I infect them with this particular type of cancer, and then I give them different various concoctions of drugs to see what happens. Some of the rats will die, some of the rats might live. Nobody's going to be too concerned about that. If I'm an anthropologist with the same question, I can't do that. I can't get 5,000 people and lock them up in cages and infect them with cancer and give them drugs to see what happens. So social sciences are limited, and in some ways, that means that the conclusions that we're able to make are a little bit more vague. We oftentimes cannot be as precise as the natural sciences can, because the things that we're studying don't lend themselves to being studied in the same way. So I want you to give some thought to this idea of science and what is science and how science works. And it's important because when we do get into Chapter 2 and we're looking at evolutionary theory, this topic of what a theory is also becomes very important. And that really is at the core of science. It's important to see that science at its roots is simply a way that we try to look at and understand the world. But what sets science apart from other ways of looking at the world is that science requires evidence. And it has to be natural evidence. It has to be stuff that we can see and we can feel and we can measure and we can quantify. So science is based on this idea of data, of evidence, that I can have an argument, and my argument is only as good as the evidence that I have to support it. And that's where all of science comes from. So we can use that information, we can use those natural processes, that evidence, to try to ask questions and to try to figure out how things work. And again, the key about science is that what science assumes is that if we look at the world around us and we see things at work in the world around us, then we should be able to explain those through natural causes. And if we study those things enough, we can figure out those natural causes, we can figure out how they work, and then we can build on that to learn how other things work. And ultimately, that's what science is at its core. So, as I say, going forward, science is going to be a really important part of the class. And I am sure we'll keep coming back to this idea of science and evidence and theories and hypotheses and stuff that hopefully you remember when you talked about the scientific method in high school biology class or something like that. And I believe that's everything. So I will move on to working on Chapter 2, and I hope you have a good day. Take care.